So it's a little gratifying to see the problems with the Mac. I'm the only one in my office that does not prefer the Mac platform. And I have to say I'm very appreciative of being invited here. My first roommate in university for the first year was from Sweden. He is one of the most brilliant people that I met there. Although being introduced to the Swedish language at 5 a.m. occasionally was a little bit difficult. So I'm going to look at, we're all good. I'm going to do a little brief overview here. I'm going to look at basically what most Americans have to start, then the largest fiber network in the United States. Then I'm going to go into the Google Fiber, which is one of the more exciting projects right now. And I'm going to end with what I think is some of the most important developments, which is how local governments are taking advantage of the current sort of transition to build really interesting networks. So I should start, though, by introducing myself. I'm with an organization that's now 40 years old. Our general philosophy is decisions should be made on as local a level as practical, based on the issue at hand. And so 9 years ago, we were looking at telecommunications and recognized that the internet had gone from a nicety to a necessity. And we, in the US regulatory environment, local governments have no real control over access to the internet unless they actually own the network themselves or it's built in some form of cooperative fashion. And so we didn't see that really changing due to the nature of the power of corporations in Washington, D.C. And so our response was to say local governments should start building their own networks. So for about 9 years, we've been really focusing on how local governments have done that well. In the areas where it hasn't worked as well, we've learned important lessons and written about why it went wrong and what can be done better. It's important to start by noting that in America, most Americans only have a choice between a relatively fast cable network, relatively for the United States, and a much slower DSL network, which is more modestly priced. Cable is very widespread in the United States. On the order of 8 or 9 out of 10 people have access to a cable network. In most cities, cable networks touch every last house, unless there's an area that's very low density. But it's important to note that it's an open secret that this is a monopoly. According to the official language coming out of Washington, D.C., there's competition, and the goal is to have robust competition. And the cable industry pays a lot of people to say independently, there's lots of competition. But when you look at how Wall Street views it, they say things like, we love Comcast because they don't really face any competition, which means they can raise prices year after year, and customers can't do anything about it. And I'm a testament to that as a loyal Comcast customer through no choice of my own, year after year, as my price goes up. They also say things like, even if you only have 2 wires coming into your home, you have these 4G networks, which are incredible, and everyone in Europe is jealous of our 4G networks in the United States because they're so wonderful. And so there's no need to worry about a wired competition, although we think there's lots of wired competition. Even if you think there's not, we have all this wireless competition. And so I think everyone here, I've had a number of conversations, and it's pretty clear that the experience here is the same in that a good 4G network is no substitute for a wired connection coming into your home, which is faster, tends to be more reliable, and importantly, does not come with any bandwidth caps on monthly usage. But these are the sorts of conversations we have to have regularly, and it's really frustrating to have to quite honestly deal with dishonest policy disputes when dealing with the real honest difficulty of building fiber networks is hard enough on its own. If you're in the United States and you're on a fiber to the home network, odds are you're getting it from Verizon's Fios, touching over 15 million households, although a lot of those people aren't taking access from it yet, something that Verizon is focusing on really trying to improve. They want to focus on getting more people connected to the network infrastructure they've already built, and they have no plans at this point to continue rolling it out. So we have this major jump in terms of access to fiber to the home networks in the United States over recent years that is now more or less plateauing because they brought so many people onto a fiber to the home network in such a short period of time. So I'm not going to speak a whole lot about it, which is a little weird because it's the largest fiber-to-the-home network in the United States, but it's not really going anywhere, and frankly, it's not really doing anything interesting other than delivering slightly higher capacity connections at a greater reliability. But the prices are pretty similar to what you get over a cable network. So we come to Google Fiber, which is a very exciting project. I often find myself praising Google Fiber even as I recommend to communities that it would be better to build their own network than to go with Google Fiber for long-term reasons. But Google Fiber is tremendously important in that it totally changed the discussion in the United States. AT&T has not built a fiber network. They built an impressive DSL network that uses fiber deeper into the neighborhoods, and they called it a fiber network. And so there was a discussion as to who would ever need more than the 40 megabits that we deliver down and maybe 5 up if you live close to the fiber. And Google basically said, look, we need really fast networks, and it needs to be affordable. And so they came in and they said, we're going to do a gigabit for $70 a month. And all of a sudden, there's all kinds of discussion. What can you do with a gigabit? As though when we build a highway, our goal is to figure out how to get as many people on that highway as soon as possible, right? I mean, it's not a discussion that happens when it comes to physical infrastructure. We build it over capacity, and as it fills up, we build more. But when Google builds this very high-capacity highway effectively, the first question is, do we need it? Can we fill it up immediately? Which is the wrong question. But it got us to the point where we have cities now, and Google's not the only one, where we have this very high-capacity infrastructure, and we can see businesses moving there, and we can see the benefits. And people who have it, they can talk about it. And so when we talk with elected leaders, we're getting past the point where someone says, I don't understand the difference between fiber and DSL, because it's all broadband. It's something that comes up regularly, but people are starting to understand that higher capacity speeds are important, even if you're doing the same old things, because you're no longer waiting. It's a better experience. And Benoit has just finished a presentation yesterday, in fact, talking about how everyone notices this when they're actually on the fiber network. So Google Fiber is tremendously important, even though it does not touch very many Americans. They started building in Kansas City. They're about to start building in Austin, Texas, and they're converting a municipal fiber network in Provo that was savagely attacked by the state legislature and ultimately failed financially and has been privatized to Google. So there's 3 cities that are getting it, and then just this week there's been an announcement that Google's working with a number of cities in 9 metropolitan areas across the United States to evaluate their processes and figure out whether or not it would be appropriate and feasible for Google to build their fiber network there. And one of the outcomes is that even if Google decides not to, that those cities will be in a better position to build their own network or work with another provider to build it. And so it's important to all the fiber and the cable networks that I've talked about, these are all closed networks. There's no real competition. If you own the wire as a cable or telephone company, you own the customer. And that's their stated policy. It's very smart because they can raise my prices year after year, and I'm not going to do anything about it. So this is one of the issues that we're dealing with in the United States. This is the point where I'm going to transition into what local governments are doing, many of which have duplicated that model of monopoly access, and some of whom, where I'm going to end the presentation, have gone with a more open access approach, often a little different than what's happened here in Sweden. But we have about 400 local governments that have built their own networks that provide some level of access to local businesses and residents. I think there's probably more than 1,000 local governments that have their own networks that provide access to municipal buildings and schools and things like that. It's very hard to track those down in a country with over 300 million people, but we're working on it. So the interesting thing is that almost all of these cities on the map here that have built these fiber networks that are available to local businesses and or residents is that they're almost all municipal public power utilities. So they have a municipal electric department. In the United States, over 2,000 cities, mostly cities of less than 15,000 people, have their own municipal electric departments. And they've been the first ones to really go out and build these networks for a variety of reasons, one of which is a sense of can-do attitude, which is they're not intimidated by the idea of delivering this infrastructure and having a billing system and dealing with customer complaints and things like that. So you'll see some states shaded in red. There's 19 of these states that have enacted barriers to discourage local networks. Everything from what we might think of as a little hoop to jump through, which is not very problematic, to a law that basically says, thou shalt not, under any circumstances, build a fiber optic network or an internet network or a telecommunications network, all to varying definitions. And so this is an issue that we're dealing with at the federal level to some extent, and we're looking to resolve in a variety of ways that are unique to U.S. law. But the Federal Communications Commission this week also made an important announcement. And in fact, if this is correlative, I'm going to come to Sweden more often, because a lot of interesting things have happened since I left, including 1 foot of snow just fell on my house over the last few hours in Minnesota. So I've missed a lot, and it's been terrific because I've learned quite a bit from people here at Stokab and people at the conference. So I'm very appreciative. But the Federal Communications Commission has announced that it is going to look at states that limit local authority to build networks and whether or not that's a barrier that the FCC itself can remove to infrastructure deployment, which is a power that it has that our courts haven't really interpreted how far it goes. But this idea of prices varying from community to community in the United States is for these telecommunications services is quite a driving force. This is a slide that I expected to have this reaction in this room. In the United States, most of us pay 1/10 this price for gasoline. This is a price per gallon. So you can imagine the difficulty of going from a community that may pay $3 per gallon of gasoline to a community that would pay $40 per gallon. But this is what we do in telecommunications regularly. And in fact, prices in the United States for similar services to businesses can vary by a factor of 100 from community to community. So even though local governments building networks can result in a variety of benefits across all levels of society, most communities that have done it for jobs. They have existing employers they want to keep, and they want to lure new employers to town, especially the new high-tech industry, educated high-tech jobs, those sorts of things. So it's important to note that of the 400 communities that have invested in these kind of networks and made them available, the number one priority is attracting new jobs, the number two priority is attracting new jobs, and the number three priority is to lower prices and give people a few more options and that sort of thing, but really it's about jobs. So we've written about a number of communities that have built these networks, and Chattanooga is one that I wrote a report on that's it's a little bit dated. It's a year and a half old, almost 2 years old now. It's, I think, one of the best places in the United States to get internet access. The first community that had a gigabit available everywhere. They priced it at $300 per month, $350 per month. Very few people took them up on it. However, they reduced that price over a few years to $70 per month. One of the things we find with municipal networks is that they come into a market and all the prices drop. But the municipal network generally is not the lowest price in the area. But the municipal network prices tend to stay the same over time or even decrease when you factor in inflation. So it's an interesting result that over time has tremendous benefits to the community. So these three communities, Bristol, Virginia, it was actually one of the first fiber to the home networks in the United States, now almost 14 years old. Lafayette, Louisiana, which had this incredible grassroots experience and had to fight for 4 years against all kinds of dirty tricks from the incumbents, lawsuits, spent over $2 million to defend their right to build their own network, finally did it, one of the more impressive networks in the United States. And then Chattanooga. I think there's some very interesting examples of the benefits of these networks. In Chattanooga, they have incredible customer service and going up against some of the most hated companies in the United States. It's a very big selling feature. But I want to move on to open access networks, which are very few and far between in the United States. Almost all networks in the United States are expected to pay for themselves over a short time horizon. Elected officials don't like to have something running in the red for too long. I'm sure that's not unique to us, meaning an investment that's losing money. This Utopia project in the United States is about 10 years old and took the name Utopia, which was very grand. The idea they're going to build this incredible network. Unfortunately, it was not able to pay its bills due to a variety of difficulties, both imposed from without, from the private corporations and the state government that opposed the project, and from bad management decisions from within the early management. So they had to raise their sales taxes, the communities that were involved, to pay for this infrastructure. So it's viewed as a horror story in the United States of, oh, don't do what Utopia did. It's a disaster. When you evaluate it, you find that, yes, they had to raise their taxes to pay for it, but local businesses refused to move outside of those communities because they're so used to the service and the high-quality access. It's probably the only place in the United States where you can really get a choice between 13, 14 providers. Seems to me to be incredibly high number of providers to choose between. But because of the financial experience, very few communities see it as a success, and no one really wants to try and duplicate it. The result has been communities that want to build a fiber network, particularly one that expands everywhere quickly, where you do a lot of bonding. The expectation is that you cannot pay back the costs of building the network and the operating expenses with the revenues from the network. And in large part, that's because the incumbents refuse to use it. The incumbents will continue using their sad old infrastructure, which is nowhere near as good, because they want to kill the model. They want to make sure that they don't have to face competition, and they don't like losing control of the network as well, which is their number one stated reason. But fundamentally, these companies were built to exist in a monopolistic environment where they did not have to compete on the basis of services or really prices. And so it's not just a preference that they don't face competition, it's an existential threat to the way that they do business. We're seeing more open access because of federal government involvement. The federal government, as a result of that unfortunate downturn, had a stimulus project and put $7.4 billion into fiber networks, mostly fiber networks. And those came with a requirement that there be some open access conditions. One of those networks is in New Hampshire, and it's connecting a number of individual homes, about 1,000 homes right now, and it's going to be expanding over time. But a lot of these networks were open access in terms of really between cities, backhaul links. Most of the networks did not actually go to the homes, and so we're still working on that piece, but it fundamentally expanded the ability of communities who before may have had only one provider who could get them on the internet. Now they may have a choice of providers because of those investments. So over time, we'll see that changing things. But the biggest success, and this is how I'll end with the open access, has been the incremental approaches, which is to say cities that have said, we're going to put a little bit of fiber in the ground today and a little bit tomorrow, and if we have a capital project that's tearing up the streets, we're going to put some fiber in then, and we're going to put a little bit of money into it, but not a lot. We're not going to borrow. And the revenues that we generate from that will reinvest in building the network. So Danville, which had the highest unemployment rate in Virginia for a long time, a small community, very rural community just outside the city core, has done this and had tremendous results. And we're going to see more of this over time. The city of Santa Monica, which has a case study which is coming out in another week or so by me, has had the exact same motivation as Stockholm, 1996. They said people are going to dig up our beautiful streets all the time. We're going to put in fiber and figure out how to do it, and they've built an impressive network. And then the most common dark fiber, the most impressive dark fiber approach has been in probably the city of Palo Alto, which is Silicon Valley in California, where they have dark fiber available in a number of places, and it's been financially wonderful for the utility. However, it's on the order of 100 businesses that use it with maybe 300 physical connections. And in part, in talking with Ander, I think it's probably because the price is quite a bit higher for dark fiber, which is to say that it's quite a bit higher than here in Stockholm, but it's dirt cheap for the United States. Nonetheless, it hasn't resulted in that kind of dynamic where an apartment building owner would want to connect to the network and do that. So where we do have dark fiber available, we don't see the same sort of results that Stockholm eventually achieved. And then the final example is Ammon, Idaho, which is a town that almost no one in the United States has heard of. But it's very impressive community that has, I think, the right combination of leadership and technical knowledge to make open access really interesting, where they built a network at first to really serve the water department and a number of others, but they put in a lot of fiber, and they're really committed to having other service providers deliver the services. And they're going to be building it on an incremental basis as well and expanding it over time. So as Benoit says, we'll wait 20 years and see what happens. But I think that these incremental basis networks is the way we're going to see these networks grow in the United States. Any city that is going to bond a lot of money to build a citywide network over 2 or 3 years is probably going to be the only provider on that network, because it's the best way to reassure investors that it'll be paid back. So thank you very much, and we can go into much greater detail on all of these things depending on what you'd like to talk about.